What does it mean to be brave? Sometimes we tend to think of being brave as being someone who has no fear. But actually, being brave doesn't mean that you don't have fear. It means in spite of the uncertainties, in spite of the fear you may feel, you move forward instead. This series we're closing out today is a series through the book of 1 Peter, and we've called it Brave in a New World. And Peter is going to end his letter called 1 Peter, trying to encourage us to live in bravery when times are uncertain. But in order to live bravely, we have to understand what bravery really entails. What does it mean to be brave? And here's the irony. For you to be a person of courage and bravery, you have to be brave in humility. We are living in, right now, some uncertain times. But what does it mean to move forward with courage when you don't know what the future holds? It may surprise you to understand that the real foundation for courage is actually humility. Think about it. Imagine someone who saves another person out of the ocean because of a shark attack. Or imagine a fireman who rushes into the flames to save someone from a burning building. Or imagine a Christian who stands up for what is right and stands up for Jesus in the midst of a culture that makes fun of you for doing so. You see, all of those examples demonstrate that courage isn't a lack of fear. It's in the midst of the fear, still moving ahead and obeying anyway. It's being afraid and yet being faithful. You see, true courage comes and flows from a strong concern that you have for other people without any regard to what will happen to you. I like this definition of humility that I read this week, where one author said, humility is not a sign of weakness. You know, that's the way we normally think of humility, that it's a sign of weakness. But in actuality, humility is a sign of strength. And here's why humility is a sign of strength. Because humility is for people who are brave enough to surrender their ego into the hands of God, so that the Spirit of God can reclaim His role as master over you, and so that your spirit can go back to being a servant of the divine. So Peter is going to close out his letter here in 1 Peter, talking to us about how to be brave in a new world or in uncertain times. But the way he's going to show the way that we move forward in bravery is by talking a lot about humility. So let's look at the passage together. It begins in 1 Peter chapter 5. We're going to look at verses 1 through 7 this morning. And now, Peter says, a word to you who are elders in the church. I too am an elder and a witness to the sufferings of Christ. And I too will share in His glory when He is revealed to the whole world. And as a fellow elder, I appeal to you to care for the flock that God has entrusted to you. Watch over it willingly, not grudgingly, not for what you will get out of it, but because you are eager to serve God. Don't lord it over people assigned to your care, but lead them by your own good example. And when the great shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of never-ending glory and honor. In the same way, you who are younger must accept the authority of the elders. And all of you, dress yourselves in humility as you relate to one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So, humble yourselves under the mighty power of God, and at the right time, He will lift you up in honor. Give all of your worries and cares to God, for He cares about you. That's through verse number 7. So, Peter is showing you and me that if we're going to survive in uncertain times, if the church is going to thrive in days that are unprecedented, we have to be brave in humility toward one another. Bravery only comes through humility, and humility is the key. Now, I want you to see how that's the case. Now, as we look at these 7 verses, let me just kind of outline what he's talking about. He's saying, look, if you're going to move forward in these uncertain times, you need leaders who are characterized by humility to be able to lead you. Leadership is so important in uncertain times, but not just any kind of leaders, humble leaders. Secondly, if you're going to be able to make it through uncertain times and stay together as a church, you've got to be humble toward each other. Because if you have arrogance and pride toward one another, it will divide the church and scatter the flock. So you have to position yourselves in humility toward each other. And then finally, he's going to show that the key is not only do we need humble leaders and we need to be humble toward each other, but ultimately we all need to humble ourselves beneath the mighty hand of God. So it's humility all the way through. So let's look at each one of these in turn. First of all, he says for the church to survive and thrive in uncertain times and to move forward bravely in these days in which we live, we need to be shepherded by humble leaders. That's verses 1 through 4. Humble leaders are those individuals that are willing to put themselves out there to shepherd the flock. Now, if somebody is going to step forward in times whenever Christianity is unpopular, or you're being persecuted or slandered for your faith, you know, it takes some brave people that are willing to step into the fray and step to the forefront to say, I will lead God's people in the midst of those kinds of days. I won't draw back. I won't cower down, but instead I'll be willing to lead in the midst of that because God's people need leadership. Otherwise, they'll be like sheep without a shepherd, and they'll be scattered in every direction. I want to tell you, church, that in today's day and time, what the church desperately needs, almost in every place that I'm aware of, is the need for strong leaders to be raised up, for strong leaders to lead the way in the church. You see, so often the church is floundering for lack of strong spiritual leadership. But strong spiritual leadership is about leaders who will humble themselves to serve and humble themselves underneath the direction of God. You see, a humble leader is someone who is transparent about their lives, who set a good example. They're those individuals that live in a way that are worthy of imitation. In fact, for Peter, whenever he speaks to the shepherds, he doesn't say it's optional. He says it is a requirement that those leaders, those shepherds, would lead by their example. We need spiritually mature leaders who will lead the flock in uncertain times. I am so thankful, and I'll just tell you the truth. There are a lot of churches I'm aware of that severely struggled over the last couple of years for lack of strong, humble leadership. But at Northside, I'm thankful to say, we've got some shepherds that led in a marvelous way, in a very humble way, in a serving kind of way, watching over the flock, checking on the flock. This is the kind of leadership that Peter demonstrates, that Peter says is essential in days like these. We'll say more about this in upcoming weeks, but we're at a point here at Northside where every 3 years we have an additional opportunity for the congregation to appoint additional shepherds over the flock and to reaffirm the shepherds that are serving. That's going to be upcoming in the weeks to come. And I want you to be thinking ahead of time. Before that time comes, be praying over, fasting over, and asking God to raise up spiritual shepherds that will shepherd over the flock. Now, what kind of leaders are we talking about here? Peter uses 3 different terms to describe these leaders, 3 different Greek words. In the first word that he uses, when he says, I appeal to you elders, that's the Greek word presbyteros. That's a word that means spiritually mature men, spiritually mature individuals that are shepherds of the flock. So you need men that are spiritually mature, spiritually tenured in their faith. Secondly, he calls them the episkopoi, or the overseers. So these are spiritually mature men that are willing to oversee the flock, watch over the flock, the church, the members of the body of Christ. And then thirdly, he says, you are to shepherd. Some translations say care for the flock or feed the flock. The word there in the original Greek is poimen, which means to shepherd. That is, yes, to feed, but also to spiritually care for, to bind the wounds of the broken, to watch over and spiritually counsel and direct and be spiritual fathers for the church. And so he uses these 3 terms to describe these leaders. And when he says that they need to lead by their example, I like what Lynn Anderson wrote in his book, They Smell Like Sheep, which is a beautiful book about this role of shepherds in the church. He says, a spiritual leader is the kind of person that God-hungry people want to be like. You see, humble leaders are those that are motivated by a desire to want to see God's kingdom thrive. Now, I'll tell you, in a lot of churches, there is a lack of leadership, humble spiritual leadership, men that are willing to step forward. There's a variety of reasons for that. But one of the reasons is that it's like, who am I to step forward? Who am I to put myself in that position to try to help direct and lead the flock? Well, I'll tell you this, men of the church. God may be preparing you for that role. God may be calling you to that role. And you need to be open to the fact that God needs shepherds that will watch over the flock, that love Jesus and want to see the kingdom of God thrive in this day and time. And I want to ask you, will you be brave? Will you be brave in humility? To humble yourself beneath God and say, God, I know I've got a lot of mistakes. I know I'm not a perfect person, but I know I love you, and I know that I want to see God's kingdom thrive, and I'm willing to humble myself and be used by you however you call me to be used. Now, the kind of humility that these leaders demonstrate themselves with, and this is so key, and Peter really doubles down on this. In fact, he kind of gives a triple kind of emphasis on this. Whenever he shows, listen, the kind of leadership we're talking about, when you talk about brave leadership, it is humble leadership. It is not domineering leadership. In fact, he says these leaders need to have the kind of motivation that they genuinely care for people and love the kingdom. That they shouldn't serve grudgingly, but willingly. In other words, in this position, if they're feeling forced to do it, it should be willing. Secondly, he says they shouldn't serve greedily or for some kind of gain that will come to them. To be in this role is not some kind of role where well, what's going to come to me? What kind of prestige? What kind of position is this going to, what kind of spotlight is this going to shine on me? That's not the kind of leadership we're talking about. Not greedy for what the gain would be for you. It is humble leadership. And finally, he says, not lording it over the flock. Not a domineering leadership, but the kind of leadership that leads by example. You see, if we're going to be successful and thrive in an uncertain new world, we need leaders who will lead bravely in the church, but lead bravely in humility. But then secondly, he says we need to be unified together as a church if we're going to survive and thrive. And the only way we can be unified is if we, all of us, position ourselves in humility toward each other. That's verse number 5. So in verse 5, he talks to those of us that are younger. And I wonder, when I read this, why is Peter singling out younger people? And he says, you who are younger, submit to the authority of the elders. And I think Peter understood something then that is just as true now, if not more so. And that is that those of us that are younger oftentimes are the ones that are the most resistant to following guidance and leadership. And so Peter gives this advice to those of us that are younger, and he says, you need to humble yourself underneath the wise spiritual guidance, the mature leadership of those that are the shepherds over the church. But then he goes on to say, not only that, but in verse number 5, he says, when he's speaking to those that are younger, he says, all of you, verse 5, dress yourselves in humility as you relate to one another. So I think he's talking here, he says all of you, he's saying those that are older, and specifically the shepherds, the leaders of the church, and those that are younger, each of you need to clothe yourselves with humility toward each other. See, I think that elders instill confidence, or shepherds instill confidence in those in whom they lead. Those in whom they lead have confidence in them whenever they demonstrate humility. And I'll just show you why this is so true. Sometimes we think spiritual maturity means that somehow you put on this facade of having it all together, of living this kind of pristine, perfect life. But what Peter will demonstrate, and I'm going to show you in just a second where he demonstrates this, is that real spiritual maturity is being honest about yourself, is being someone who is transparent, to confess your failings, to admit your weaknesses, but then to celebrate the grace of what God is doing, has done, and will do in your life. This is true maturity. Listen to what Peter says. He says, I exhort you as elders, as a fellow elder. He calls himself a fellow elder. But then he also says, this is back in verse number 1, he says this now. He says, I too am an elder, and look at this, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ. Do you realize what Peter is saying right there? Peter is highlighting the fact, as an elder in the church, as a spiritual leader, as an apostle, he is shining the light on the reality that he was a witness of the sufferings of Christ. And do you remember what kind of witness he was? This is the same Peter who, whenever he reminds his readers that he witnessed the sufferings of Christ, you know what that's bringing to the forefront? Peter's weakest moment of when he denied Jesus 3 times. Whenever he stumbled, when he fell. And yet, when Jesus appears to Peter in his resurrection, Jesus asks him 3 times, Peter, do you love me? And gives Peter the chance to then reverse the 3-time denial with a 3-time confession. So what I love about what Peter does here is that Peter is highlighting the fact that true spiritual maturity and being brave in humility as a leader and toward each other is us being honest about ourselves. Because whenever we confess the failings of our lives, and we then admit the power of what Jesus has done in our lives, what we're elevating is not our own goodness or our own morality. We're elevating and celebrating the grace of God and the grace of Jesus Christ. You see, we need leaders that will elevate the grace of God and the grace of Christ and not be dependent upon their own pride. And Peter goes on to say, here's why. Because God opposes the proud. but He gives grace to the humble. Now, I don't know about you, but I think I do, but there's one thing that I know I for sure do not want, and I know you don't want either. And that is for the God of heaven and earth, the creator of all things, to be actively in opposition against me. He says, if you want God opposed to you, then you go right ahead with your arrogance and pride, because God is opposed to the proud. But if you want the free gift of God's mercy and grace, He gives grace to the humble. So He tells us if we're going to survive and be brave in uncertain times, we have to be united together. And the thing that will unite us is when we're humble toward each other. And let me tell you, church, I'm thankful that by God's grace, we did as well as a church here at Northside as we did over the last couple of years. But you know as well as I do that whenever the heat was on, when the pressure was on, when there was great degrees of uncertainty and lots of polarization in our culture over a variety of issues, that many churches really fractured. And so many times it really wasn't because of the issues, it was because of an arrogance that we had toward each other. You see, we have to humble ourselves toward each other. Younger, humble yourself under the spiritual leadership of your leaders. Those leaders, live your life in such a way that you are demonstrating humility toward other people, and you'll win their respect. And so here we have this unity toward each other that will hold us together. To be humble, what does it mean to be humble? Well, to be humble is to be realistic about yourself. That you cannot make your life work, not really, without God. Humility is acknowledging that reality. So, we need these leaders that will shepherd us in humility. We need to be united together in humility toward each other. And then we need to be guided by humility before God. Verses 6 through 7, he gets down to this point. Let's look at it again. He says that we need to humble ourselves under the mighty power of God. And at the right time, He will lift you up in honor. Give all your worries and cares to God, for He cares for you. Humility before God is accepting His purposeful hand in allowing difficulty. Let me repeat that, and then I want to explore it for just a moment. Humility before God is accepting His purposeful hand in allowing difficulty. You see, when you humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, what you are doing is you are saying, Lord, I don't understand why this is happening in my life. I don't understand why it seems in your sovereignty and divine purpose and power that you would allow that to happen in this world. I don't know what you're doing, but I humble myself. Why? Because I know who you are and I know your character. That you are a God of love and mercy that cares for me and wants to see what is ultimately good in my life, even when I can't see it or understand it. You see, being humble before God is having the spirit of like Joseph had. Whenever Joseph by his brothers were sold into slavery. Whenever Joseph by his brothers was before that thrown into a pit. Whenever Joseph was accused of a crime he didn't commit and was the target of injustice by being thrown in that prison. Time and time again, bad thing after bad thing after bad thing happened in the life of Joseph. And yet when you read his story in the book of Genesis, you see over and over again in the midst of those bad happenings, the reoccurring statement, and the Lord was with Joseph. And the Lord was with Joseph. You see, many of us, when we find ourselves in the pit, when we find ourselves betrayed by others, when we find ourselves accused of something we didn't do, we say, well, where is God? Is God really with me? And the Bible says the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. And Joseph humbled himself, and at the right time, God exalted him. You see, humility before God is accepting, Lord, I don't understand your whole purpose of life. I don't have a vantage point from which I can see all of the comings and goings of life. And so because I don't have that vantage point, but because I know your character and your care for me, I will entrust my spirit, even in the good times and even in the bad, that you will do what is best for me, that you have my ultimate good in mind, and therefore I will accept your purposeful hand in sometimes allowing difficulty to come into my life. Humble yourself before the mighty hand of God. But humility is also the ability to cast your anxieties about that. Your anxieties about the uncertainties of life, being able to cast them on the Lord. Your translation may say something like that, and cast all your cares and worries, cast your anxieties upon the Lord. I looked at the original language, and that's a great translation because the original Greek word there means to throw or to cast. In other words, you take the anxieties you're feeling, the uncertainties you're feeling about life, and you take those purposefully, and you say, I will humble myself underneath the mighty hand of God, knowing He loves me and He cares for me, even though I don't understand why He would allow this to happen, but I'm still feeling this uncertainty, I'm feeling this anxiety. I will take it all and I'll ball it up and I'll cast it on the Lord. I'll release it and give it to Him. And you say, how could you do that? How can you get to a place where you can take your anxieties about life and cast them upon the Lord? He tells us in the last phrase, for your Lord, He cares for you. You see, humility is a confidence of spirit where you are absolutely convinced that God sees everything that happens in your life. He knows everything that transpires, and He cares about your struggles. He cares about them. We don't always know the specifics of why God is allowing certain things to happen in the days and the events of our lives. But one thing I do know for certain is that God works all things together for good for those that love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. Romans 8:28. Verse 29 tells us what that purpose is, that He wants to shape us and mold us into the image of His Son. You see, God has a plan for us. He wants to make us and mold us into somebody better than we are. And if we will surrender and humble ourselves underneath His mighty hand, it allows God to do that work in your life. You see, we need to be guided by humility if we're going to be brave in uncertain days. These are the three things we so desperately need. If we're going to be brave, church, as we move forward in this world that is uncertain, in this new world, we need humility to empower us to live bravely. And that kind of humility means that we need to follow the wise direction that is given from mature spiritual leaders around us. Be willing to follow that direction. Secondly, it means, church, we've got to stay united together. And the way we stay united together is we humble ourselves toward each other. And then finally, if we're going to be humble, we've got to release those anxieties because we know that God knows and God cares for each one of us. Church, we're living in uncertain days. We are living in a time that is very different than what many of us have experienced. But we can be brave in these days. And the church can be strong in the midst of the trial. And the church can be perhaps more effective and shine brighter in the midst of the darkness than ever before. But we have to be people who are committed to the Lord. We are convinced of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We have a living hope in the resurrection of Jesus and what that brings, the inheritance for us that is imperishable and undefiled, reserved in heaven for us. We have to be brave in these convictions, but those convictions must lead us to the cross. And the example that Jesus gave for us, that although he was reviled, he did not revile in return. Although he was spat upon, he did not return insult, but he humbled himself before God. And we must follow the way of the cross and be brave in humility. And the question is, will you be brave?